thank you for joining us today. We're really pleased that so many people could join us. My name is Martha, and I am the director of a nonprofit called Foxglove, and this is my co-founder and co-director, Rosa. We have automated captioning that people can turn on to use. There's a CC button at the bottom of the player should you want to use that. So Foxglove exists to make the use of technology fair, and we litigate and campaign. And a core area of our work aims to make the use of government algorithms fair, open, and legal. And over the course of 2 or 3 years, we've challenged multiple discriminatory and secretive algorithms, including the A-level grading algorithm, which initially downgraded 40% of student grades in 2020 when students couldn't sit their exams due to COVID, and a Home Office visa streaming algorithm, which was used to sort visa applications which discriminated on the basis of nationality. And today, algorithms are in use by central government and local authorities to make consequential decisions about our lives, including everything from welfare, immigration, education, and health, often without much transparency about how these systems actually work. And at this event, we're going to talk about some of the problems with the way that these systems are used. And we'll be talking about a live case that Foxglove is supporting the Greater Manchester Coalition of Disabled People to bring, which is about an algorithm in use by the Department of Work and Pensions to flag people for benefit fraud investigations. And this event is particularly timely because just last night, the Greater Manchester Coalition for Disabled People, the GMCDP, sent a formal legal letter, which is called a pre-action letter, to the DWP, telling them to come clean about exactly how this algorithm works and provide evidence that it doesn't unfairly discriminate against disabled people. And we're really lucky today to be joined by amazing speakers, including Laura Lazaro-Cabarra from Privacy International, who initially uncovered this DWP algorithm, and Rick Burgess from the Greater Manchester Coalition of Disabled People, the group challenging the secretive algorithm, and Will Perry from Monkton Chambers, who is part of the legal team bringing the case. And so in the next sort of 50 minutes or so, we'll hear from each of the speakers, and there's going to be a Q&A. So please feel free to submit your questions at any time using the box on the screen, and you don't have to wait until the end. I think also you can vote if there are questions that other people have asked that you find particularly interesting. So please also do that. But let's first hear from Rick. Rick, thank you so much for joining us. It would be really great if you could tell us a bit about what we do know about the algorithm and why you and the GMCDP are concerned about it.
Well, we know that the DWP use automated systems, which they try not to call an algorithm, but from appearances, it does appear it operates like an algorithm. And I think the issue is largely that unless algorithms are constructed extremely scrupulously, they tend to reproduce the biases and discriminations in wider society and culture. So as we work from the social model of disability, which is all about removing the barriers in society that disable us, we suspect that this algorithm it also acts as a disabling barrier in that it will be overpicking disabled people for investigations of fraud, and the result of that for the person who's picked for that is extremely distressing.
And could you tell us a little bit more about the impact that it has? I've heard you talk before about, how people feel when they think they might have been targeted, without actually often knowing, in fact, that the algorithm has been what's resulted in them being targeted.
You have no idea how it came about that you're being investigated. None whatsoever. It is absolutely classically Kafkaesque. You don't know who your accuser is. You don't know why you've suddenly been picked out. Typically, it's either a envelope, a phone call, or an email. They've finally started using email. It's extremely upsetting when people get this. It's tied to a lot of the processes of the DWP, but there's a concept called the fear of the brown envelope, which is seeing an official envelope drop through your door, which could signal all kinds of upheavals to your life. And we'll have to remember that in an investigation, before anything has been proven, your benefits can be stopped. So you are treated as guilty until proven innocent.
Thank you. And what sort of prompted you to kind of what made you want to get involved in this case? Like, could you talk a bit about what the process has been like so far, from your perspective?
Well, we had a concern generally about algorithms because of that reproducing biases and then automating them, in respect of, actually, it was disability employment, and also in
Mm.
respect of race, in that people with non-English sounding names were not getting picked as much as people with English sounding names. So we had a general kind of, let's keep an eye on this. And then it just came back from another conversation in another place with someone actually from Foxglove that, we were thinking about this and they were thinking about it. And it's one of those things that disabled people are consistently always having to sort of be tested. We're always having to prove ourselves. We're always having to fill in forms. We're always having to pass tests. It's like, you're always being kind of questioned about your identity. And this to think that an algorithm might be unfairly doing this, it becomes this new barrier that I think we have to face and confront and deal with, and hopefully solve it. Find out what's going on. And by the way, the DWP can tell us tomorrow what's going on. There is nothing stopping them. That we have had to send them a letter saying we'll take you to court if you don't is entirely because of their behaviour.
Absolutely, thank you. And we're so glad that you are bringing this case, Rick. It's absolutely fantastic, and thank you for joining us. It might be interesting for us all to hear a bit from Laura. Laura joins us from Privacy International, and Privacy International actually initially uncovered the existence of the algorithm, I understand, deep in the depths of a training manual. So it would be great, Laura, if you could talk us through a little bit how you discovered the existence of the algorithm and perhaps what some of your concerns were.
Thank you, Martha. Just a quick note about us. Privacy International is a London-based organization which campaigns against companies and governments exploiting our data and technologies. And we came into all of this as early as 2018, when we were doing an entirely different thing. We're investigating the London counter-fraud hub after it was announced that the system had been successfully trialed in Camden, Ealing, Croydon, and Islington. And in essence, the London Counter-Fraud Hub was a system used in order to detect fraud in applications for the council tax single-person discount, although famously, it had a 20% failure rate. There was a lot of noise around this, and so we submitted freedom of information requests to the councils where the system had been originally deployed and trialed to find out more. And what we came to learn is that the London Counter-Fraud Hub initiative had not progressed to a full operational stage after the initial pilot phase ended due to the lack of sign-up from all the local authorities. But at that point, we thought, if this sort of system was being trialed by some councils, wasn't it possible that something similar was happening nationwide? And so we started looking into the Department for Work and Pensions. And in particular, we looked at two sources of information, one of which Martha has already mentioned, a training manual for DWP staff, Department for Work and Pension staff, looking into fraud. But similarly, the annual reports and accounts from the Department for Work and Pensions for 2017 and 2018. And unexpectedly and interestingly, it was this latter piece of information that turned out to be interesting, because in those accounts and reports, the Department for Work and Pensions explicitly mentioned using cutting-edge artificial intelligence to crack down on organized criminal gangs committing large-scale benefit fraud. And so when we read that, we thought, okay, surely the 2019 training manual for fraud detection must mention this. And although the 29 fraud detection manual had lots of fascinating and concerning information about the Department for Work and Pensions surveillance practices, there wasn't a single mention of artificial intelligence in the manual. We thought that was quite odd. And so we filed some more freedom of information requests at that time. And after some back and forth between ourselves and the DWP, we learned that first it was using what it called a general data matching and data analysis service, which was housed within the Risk and Intelligence Department. And they used it to identify cases of fraud. Of course, we asked for further information, including any algorithms involved, any datasets used, et cetera, but they refused to provide it, relying on an exemption in the Freedom of Information Act, Section 31, which basically sets out the law enforcement exemption. Namely, it entitles public authorities to reject providing information that is requested if it is likely that that information is likely to prejudice the prevention and detection of crime. So we got denied that, but despite the fact that we hit a brick wall at that point, there was something else that the Department for Work and Pensions mentioned that existed in addition to this data analysis and data matching system. And then they went into artificial intelligence, which had been originally mentioned in the 2017 and 2018 annual accounts and reports. So when we asked about that specifically, we were told that the AI, the artificial intelligence used in-house, did not have a specific name, and that they were exploring the potential use of techniques such as machine learning and network analysis. However, and these are their words, these are still in development. So what we were left with at that point was some sort of indication that artificial intelligence was in contemplation, but no confirmation that it was being used as of yet. And so when we found that out, we were quite surprised because we had not come across anything like this before in the UK, apart from the London counter-fraud hub, but we know that that didn't go anywhere really. And what we knew about the use of automation warfare services, we knew in relation to work and research that had taken place abroad. So, for example, we knew about the research undertaken by Regina Eubanks in her notorious book, Automating Inequality, which is a fantastic piece of investigative journalism for anyone who is interested in it. But specifically, she writes about US-based examples of how welfare automation penalizes innocent people and benefits. And in her examples, these range from the loss of Medicaid benefits to parents being wrongly flagged by an automated system for child neglect, as well as the use of an algorithm to allocate housing for homeless people. And so to us, it was very worrying that something like that could be potentially happening in the UK as well. And certainly what we know until now, or rather what we don't know until now, makes us even more concerned that in addition to an algorithm being used or automation being used in the welfare system, there might be people disproportionately affected by it.
And Laura, can I ask you something which I didn't prepare you that I was going to ask you about, but I wondered if just for people listening that perhaps algorithms and technologies in the public sector might be a new concept. Could you briefly explain kind of what an algorithm is?
That's a tough question. Although I'll do my best.
In this context, yeah, that would be super helpful.
I would say an algorithm is... Go for it. Thank you, Martha. An algorithm is a function which is likely to be fed into by different variables. And these different variables, when combined, might lead to a very distinct outcome. And so it may well be that, let's imagine variable A, variable B, when input into an algorithm, might lead to outcome C. Variable D and variable E might lead to outcome F, and so on and so forth. So in essence, what we're thinking about here is the type of data that is input into a system and how that type of data, once put into a system, might yield a particular result. In the welfare system, what we would be thinking about are red flags. So what sort of automation exercise takes place? What data sets are considered by the algorithm that then would yield to someone being red flag for, say, potential fraud?
Wonderful, thank you. And Laura, I know that Privacy International has written 2 reports on this algorithm and what you found in the manual. If people want to find that and read more about that, how might they go about finding that information?
Just Google Privacy International. We have a 2-part report to reflect on the 2-part DWP surveillance manual, fraud detection manual. It's called Shedding Light on the DWP. There's part 1 and part 2. So I encourage you all, if you're interested, to follow up on that and go ahead and Google it. I can share the links in the chat as well.
Thank you so much. That would be really helpful. And I'm sure we'll come back to you, Laura, for sure. But it would be really good if we could move on to hearing from you, Will. Will is part of the legal team and is one of the barristers working on the case that the Greater Manchester Coalition for Disabled People are bringing. And it would be really good if you could talk to us a bit about the legal status of the case, what's happened or what's happened to date, what might happen next. That would be great. Thanks, Will.
Thanks very much. So, yeah, as you set out at the beginning, what we've done is we've sent what's known as a letter before action. So it's a formal letter where we're saying to the DWP, if you don't change what you're doing, we'll sue you in court. And the hope is, the best outcome for us would be the DWP say, okay, we appreciate we've got this wrong. There's a complete lack of transparency. We're going to start making information about this algorithm. Or I should actually probably say these algorithms, because we know that there is an algorithm or a sort of data matching algorithm that's being used. We know that there's some kind of AI also being used. But there is an indication that actually there are further automated technologies in place. So, DWP sort of seem to be experimenting with a wide range of different technologies in what they're doing. So anyway, best outcome for us, DWP turns around, throws their hands up in the air, they say we've got it all wrong. The alternative scenario is we get a kind of robust defense back, and the DWP explain why they think what they're doing is legal. And so the sort of purpose of the letter is to narrow the issues, understand what their arguments are, and also we've asked for a whole range of information and documents, so we sort of get a sense of how these algorithms are being used. So we've asked for a response within 28 days. They might drag their heels and take a bit longer, but I think we can probably expect a formal response sometime in the middle of March.
Brilliant, thank you. And Rose is the solicitor on this case. Is there anything that you wanted to add to what Will said?
No, I think that sounds
Brilliant.
very good. I think both, as Rick and Will have emphasised, this is very much in the DWP's kind of side of the court at the moment, and they could obviously clearly decide to respond positively to our letter, in which case proceedings won't be necessary. But if they don't, then the next step will be to issue proceedings in court.
And Will, if I could just ask you a question which sort of slightly zooms out and is kind of a bit bigger picture about perhaps how the courts are dealing with cases that relate to algorithms and this type of decision making. Is this a relatively new, presumably this is a relatively new area for the courts to be grappling with, and I wondered if you had any thoughts on that and how the courts might approach these sorts of legal questions.
Yeah, absolutely, Martha. So it is a very new area, and we haven't really got any judgments on the use of algorithms by public authorities to date, in the UK at least. So the two cases that you mentioned, the two cases that Foxglove were involved in, the Home Office streaming algorithm for visa applicants and the Ofqual exam grading algorithm, both of those cases settled in a successful way before there was any kind of hearing in court and any kind of written judgment. So there isn't kind of any established principle about how the court is going to approach these things. You've got some quite high-powered people having written in a kind of more theoretical way about it. So in particular, there's a Supreme Court judge called Lord Sales who produced a lecture on this a couple of years ago, thinking about the issues, thinking about the kind of procedural ways of dealing with challenges to algorithms, but you don't actually have any kind of UK judgments on it. What you do have, and what we've referred to in this formal letter, is a judgment in Holland. So a court in The Hague looked a few years ago at quite a similar system where a kind of black box was being used to flag people who were considered to be high risk of committing benefits and another type of social security fraud. And that was ruled to be illegal by the Dutch court in that case, because it was just so fundamentally opaque, lacking in transparency. There was no information available about how the algorithm was being used, or any kind of transparency in terms of telling individuals when they had been sort of flagged as high risk or when their personal data had been put in as an input. So that is really the kind of leading and the only case that we've been able to find where the courts have been looking at these things. So we're sort of in uncharted territory. And the other kind of aspect of that is that we're relying on some rights created by the GDPR. So the kind of it's called the General Data Protection Regulation. It's this new piece of data protection legislation that came in a few years ago. And because that's quite new, again, the sort of questions about the scope of the rights that it creates are also untested.
Brilliant, thank you. One question that I think lots of people would be asking, or is particularly interesting, is Rick. I'll come back to you if that's okay. But I think it would be really useful to know a little bit more about why people within your community feel like they've been targeted by this algorithm, particularly given it's so secretive. You know, what does the GMCDP have any thoughts on, you know, why this algorithm is thought to be targeting so many disabled people?
I think because of the other parts of the system that assess us for benefits are so also opaque and sort of accusatory, that it's created this atmosphere where I mean, they have a very poor understanding of disability and how impairments and conditions affect you and the real life circumstances. So, you know, for example, they may say, you know, this person is a wheelchair user, but we saw them stand up out of the wheelchair. Aha, it's fraud. Well, actually, an awful lot of people that use wheelchairs can also stand up for short periods out of their chair. It's simply kind of ignorance and ableism on behalf of the institution, that they're very suspicious of us. They think we're up to no good. They think we're, you know, oh, I need this money because I can't do this, or, you know, and there's an, you know, we know there's been a concerted media campaign to create this kind of scrounger narrative. The fact that people even associate fraud with benefits is a masterpiece of propaganda, because actually the fraud is 0.5%. That's 1 in 200 people. So that's not in any way a systemic issue or problem for a system. If you've got a system where it's wrong for 1 in 200 people, you've pretty well much succeeded with a great system there. But they still treat everybody as a suspect. And so we think that is replicated and in how the algorithm works. And again, you just get this, you can get weird patterns, people just being picked up, and you just cannot put any rhyme or reason about why they've suddenly been picked out. Nothing. They're not doing anything strange. They haven't changed, and it just happens. And again, you know, you're not told. You have no way of knowing how you came to get picked. So that increasingly suggests a pretty opaque system that's kind of making up its own rules.
Can I also ask, Rick, would you be able to explain a little bit about what effect an investigation has on an individual? So if you're somebody who is in receipt of a benefit, you're flagged, as part of that investigation, the benefit stops. Kind of what impact does that have on somebody in terms of their everyday life?
Well, obviously, if you're relying on that income, solely that income, then you are in big trouble for eating and paying bills and keeping a roof over your head, which are fairly important things to stay alive. I mean, it is absolutely true that disabled people are the majority of food bank users, and food bank use has exploded over the last 10 years. This may have some role in that. Even if it's not your only income, it's still extremely distressing, because you're being accused of crime. You're being said you are a bad, evil person that is doing fraud. And that's very, very distressing. It's particularly bad if you already suffer from any kind of paranoia or anxiety disorders. And it can be extremely debilitating. I know people have withdrawn from kind of life because of it. I know, there have been suicides because of it. So it is extremely harmful to people. So for those investigations to occur, I think there needs to be extremely high level of proof and suspicion before you can even start that process, because the risk to people is potentially lethal.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rick. I think if I want to come to the Q&A just in a couple of minutes, because we've got lots of questions already coming in. But just before we go to that, if it's okay, Will, I'll just come back to you, because I think it might be really interesting for people here to hear, to the extent you're able to explain, sort of a rough outline of the arguments that the GMCDP are making in their case about why the DWP needs to be much more clear and transparent and open about how this algorithm works. So it'd be great if you could just tell us a bit about the legal arguments.
Yeah, of course, and jump in if I'm being too kind of jargony. So basically, I mean, there's sort of 3 main arguments. The first is, and I think the main one at this stage, is a transparency argument. So DWP is saying we can't release any information whatsoever because people will use that to game the system, and benefit fraudsters will be able to do us out of thousands of pounds. And what we're saying is that there are transparency obligations on DWP, both under the European Convention on Human Rights and also under this piece of data protection legislation, the GDPR. So it's a kind of transparency point, and it was that kind of same point that was made by the claimant in the Dutch case that I referred to a few moments ago. So that's the first one. The second is there is a right under the GDPR to object when you are subject to what is called a solely automated decision. So a kind of classic example of that might be you apply for a job and the recruiter decides who to invite to interview and who not to invite to interview by just feeding applications through a computer without any kind of meaningful human intervention. And where that kind of process takes place, and we're saying that there is a solely automated process here when individuals are flagged as high risk. Individuals have a right to say, actually, no, I'm not going to be subject to that. I want human oversight in how this process works. And this also sort of ties in with the transparency arguments, because if there's no transparency, if individuals don't know that they're being put through the system, they don't know that they're being flagged, well, then they're not going to be able to exercise their right to say no in the first place. And then the third point is a kind of procedural point. I think a lot of people listening here will be aware of the public sector equality duty. Some people probably not as familiar with obligations to do what's called a data protection impact assessment. And it sounds a bit dry, but basically that's a duty to look at data protection practices that pose high risk to individuals. And on both of those, we're saying there's insufficient evidence that the DWP has gone through those necessary processes. So those are the kind of three strands. But the main kind of contention in a nutshell is just real lack of transparency.
That's really great, Will. Thanks so much for explaining that. And just to begin to come to some of the questions that we're being asked in the chat or in the question submission, somebody's asked whether algorithms across government should be declared. And I think Will has in part just answered some of that question with some of the kind of legal arguments that we're bringing in this case. But if I may just say briefly about something that's happening alongside this case that I think is a promising direction of travel, but isn't mandatory, I should say, is that the UK government, the Cabinet Office, over the last year or so has been working to develop an algorithmic transparency standard, taking influence from other countries across Europe where they have very clear, very open algorithmic transparency registers. So there's one in Amsterdam and there's one in Helsinki. And in those registers, everybody can go to them and can find basic information about how the algorithm works. So that might be what data is used, what sorts of decisions the algorithm makes, what you can do if you think the algorithm has made a decision about you that's unfair and you'd like to challenge it, and what safeguards are in place to ensure that these systems aren't resulting in discriminatory decision making. And the UK hasn't yet made that step, but has certainly started the process of creating this standard that we very much hope will be, rolled out across government and within local authorities.
Indeed, maybe this case will persuade them.
Indeed, yeah. So we'll start to come to some of the questions in the chat, if that's okay, and please do submit more if you have some. So let me... So, okay. Do you think where's what we've got here? So that's a good question. Someone anonymous has asked, where do the DWP put these algorithms? Is it on a person's computer? I think that's a really good question, because we don't know, as we've come across in this, as hopefully has come across in the course of this discussion, we don't know a lot about how and where these algorithms work, and hopefully a lot more will come out in the course of this case. So I'm just looking through these questions here. So
can I ask a question of Laura?
Yeah, please.
Which is that I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about how discrimination is kind of baked into algorithms, because it's something that kind of Rick kind of pointed to when he was talking. But I was wondering if you could explain a little bit, because obviously PI has looked at many algorithms over the years, how it is that discrimination is kind of baked into them.
Well, the thing that we're always coming back to as an organization is that algorithms are ultimately developed by people, and so they reflect the biases that people have. So the people who made them, obviously, they live, they're part of society. They're not these objective masterminds who are capable of extracting themselves and distancing from every single bias in the moment they get into engineering these algorithms. So, for instance, there might be assumptions about what poverty looks like, what disability looks like, and what it should look like, that might then be adversely interpreted against the people who are primarily affected by these decisions. So one example that I can think of is when we first launched our research on the DWP surveillance manual, we did a joint launch with Vice, and actually Vice News managed to get hold of someone who received disability benefits and who had been flagged for fraud risk by the DWP on account of a series of activities that she had undertaken. So she was a kind of disability rights advocate. She'd be going to a few conferences that had been mapped out by the DWP. On a different kind of aspect of her life, she'd taken flights with an airline, and then she had either taking extra large seats, seats with extra legroom, or she had not taken them. But then again, that was used by the DWP to assume that she, in fact, did not have the disability that she was claiming to be affected from, or at least she did not suffer from it to the extent that they thought she should have done. And of course, we're not saying an algorithm was involved in this particular instance, but that sort of shows the little things that some people might pick up on, people who are not affected by disability, for example, that a person who is in the disability rights movement might say, yeah, that means nothing. And I think this speaks to what Rick was saying previously, that some things might be construed totally differently by someone who has no knowledge of the situation or what a disability might look like. So that's always, those biases, those prejudices, those presuppositions are always going to be baked into the algorithm. And I believe we can only go so far in trying to fight against them. But in any event, you do need that level of human agency at some point, human due diligence, to make sure that you're not allowing those algorithms to make the full determination as to someone's entitlement in the welfare sector.
Can I ask another question, Laura, which is that during your investigations, did you find that DWP were mostly making the algorithms in-house, or were they also kind of outsourcing some of that work to third-party companies? And if so, which companies were normally the ones that were being used by DWP?
And Charlie has actually asked a very similar question in the chat. So yeah, it would be great if you could answer that, Laura.
So we didn't find that the DWP was outsourcing this. What we do know, however, is that the DWP receives information from different sorts of companies in order to build their own knowledge base about who is likely to commit fraud and who isn't. And the type of companies, there's a wide range of companies that the DWP can obtain information from. This includes banks, credit providers, insurers, credit reference agencies, money transfer companies, gas and electricity providers, telecommunication services. And so the list is, in a way, potentially endless. And none of these institutions are identified by name, of course. So we can only assume which sort of companies are involved. But the DWP has access to a wide range of information providers. And actually, I'd like to speak quickly to the person who asked about whether or not the algorithms were in our devices. I think that this question might be directed towards the potential of surveillance. I think this person might be thinking of a potential for hacking or sort of, gaining some sort of unauthorized access to a device. We don't have evidence of the DWP doing that. However, the DWP do carry out open source intelligence activities, which basically means that the DWP will, in some circumstances, consult someone's social media profiles. So while they may not be gaining access directly to your device, they might be looking you up on the internet, on the major social media platforms, to sort of work out what sort of behavior you're taking part in.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, we've more questions coming in here. This question's for Will, if that's okay. Will, you've slightly touched on this already, but it would be great if you could talk about what you think this case means for the future of the law being used to challenge algorithms that are discriminatory against people in the UK. And Rosie, you can also come in if you want to.
So I think really on two fronts. The first would be, if we do go to a hearing and get a judgment on this, the first thing that it could really do is establish what public authorities, what the government is required to do under Article 8 of the Convention, and the transparency that they have to conduct themselves with under or in that human rights context. And then the second thing is really kind of understanding what is the scope of some of the rights that individuals have under the GDPR, and in particular this provision, Article 22, which allows, as I said before, individuals to object to solely automated decision-making processes. So firstly, what is meant by a solely automated decision? There's very little case law on that. And secondly, what is the kind of scope of transparency obligations under the GDPR, and what kind of information are data subjects entitled to obtain, both sort of when the data controller or the government sort of gives out the data without a request, but also if what's called a subject access request is made. So it would be really to kind of test the limits of these new areas of law, and there's just nothing on that at the moment. There are some kind of analogous cases where, for example, the government's employed a secret policy and the courts have said, well, that is completely inimical to good government, but there's nothing really on point. So it's really in the kind of human rights and the GDPR context.
I would also add, maybe from a kind of Foxglove perspective and from a civil society perspective, I think one of the things that Foxglove hopes is that I think these algorithms very much do need to be challenged in court, as well as challenged kind of politically and from a campaigning perspective. But as Will says, this is really quite a new area of law, and I think we hope at Foxglove we've tried to show how litigation is possible over some of these issues. With the previous two cases we took with the A-level and the visa algorithm, but also with this one. So we slightly hope that this case will also inspire other groups to look and think about where and feel able to take legal challenges to the use of algorithms like this. Because there are brilliant barristers like Will who are able to work on cases like this, and Foxglove is only 5 people. So we desperately also hope that these sorts of cases, will encourage other people to think about using the law and kind of using the rights that are enshrined in the UK law to the best of their kind of ability and effect to try and challenge some of these algorithms, which at the moment we feel like are being used across government, as Martha was saying, locally and nationally, and being done so really in secret and without proper scrutiny and accountability. And these algorithms are making decisions that are affecting everybody's lives in an absolutely profound way. And if they're left unchecked, all of the discrimination kind of risks that we've been hearing about from Risk and Laura will remain in place. And so it feels incredibly important to us that we hope this case may encourage other people in civil society and other individuals to also think about challenges where it looks like an algorithm is being used unfairly and secretly and unlawfully.
Absolutely. And on that, if there's anybody listening or any family members of anyone listening who feels like they themselves might have been impacted by the algorithm that we've been discussing here today, we'd really welcome anybody getting in touch with us or the GMCDP, and we'll make sure that we share our contact details afterwards. So I think we've time for a couple more questions. And Rick, this one has come in for you, if that's okay, which is not necessarily about, which is slightly a wider question, I suppose, but it says, given everything that we've heard here, is there anything, in your opinion, that could be done to restore faith in how the DWP assesses people for benefits, fraud, investigations, or is the damage done?
I mean, if they came forward with all the information and we didn't have to take them to court, I mean, that would be a sign of some change of culture. But I think there is an active debate in our community about can the ministry ever regain the I know confidence isn't the word, even the trust, but I actually think for a lot of people think it probably has to be abolished and a new ministry for social security and independent living established that just doesn't do this policing function, this secret penal system as it's being called. To have this sort of attitude of, we're protecting the public purse from fraud, therefore we're going to suspect everyone. It is not helpful to administering what should be a social security system and a disability benefit system, which is largely meant to support you to live independently and live your best life. Instead, it's kind of, completely 180 degrees the opposite of that. So, yeah, I mean, if they want to make those steps to regain our belief in them, yeah, let's see them come up with this information like next week, like that. Let's challenge them.
We agree with you, Rick. Okay, so John Pring from the Disability News Service has a question, which I think probably would be best answered by you, Laura, if that's okay. John's asking if we know of any public bodies that have used algorithms in a fair and transparent way. For example, John's asking if there are any good practice examples to compare the DWP algorithm with.
I'm going to be honest, John, we keep looking for those good practice examples and we haven't found them yet. There'll be nothing, I think, more comfortable for us to do as an organization to find something that we can look at it seriously and say, this is helpful, this is treating people fairly, this is transparent enough, so that not just experts can understand it, but also regular people who, for instance, encounter these algorithm transparency indexes. We haven't come across that yet, but we're constantly on the lookout. And I like to say to the audience, if you ever encounter something that you think is of that standard, then please feel free to share it with organizations like ourselves or Foxglove, because we'd be more than delighted to have a look at them.
Definitely, we couldn't agree more, and we'll be sure to share everybody's details afterwards if anybody does want to get in touch. I think we've probably got time for one last question, which has just come in from Pete. And I should say actually that this recording will be available after the event. So if I know people have got in touch saying they wanted to attend and couldn't, so we'll be sure to share that. But Peter has said that he's not sure that algorithms being used in this way is new, and what's Foxglove's perspective on that? And yes, that's absolutely right. And I think the secrecy around the algorithms that we've been discussing today is part of the problem. So if I can give a separate example, actually, one of the cases that we brought very recently with a group called the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants concerned a Home Office visa streaming algorithm, which I mentioned earlier. And that algorithm had actually been in use since 2013, or was it 15? 15, and we only learned about it in 2019 because there was some press reporting in the FT, and so that algorithm had been used in secret for that entire period. So I actually don't think that I mean it's a new way of decision making in some ways, but these systems have been being used often in secret for some time, and we at Foxglove think that it is time that changed, as I'm sure many people here on this call. So we are running out of time, but before we close, I just wanted to come back to Rick quickly, because bringing it back to the case that we're challenging right now, Rick, I'm sure there are people here that would like to be able to help or contribute to the vitally important case that you're bringing. So if people do want to get involved, what can they do?
To be brutally mercenary about this, you know what? We have got a crowd justice crowdfunder, so if you've got a bit of spare cash, that's always nice. Instantly, that's really only for the worst comes to the worst, and we lose, and the DWP are, making us pay them some money. Hopefully, that won't happen. But yeah, there's the crowdfunder. But I think more importantly is if you or someone you know think you've been affected by this fraud algorithm, please get in touch with either the GM Coalition of Disabled People or Foxglove. And we need that kind of lived experience, that testimony. Also, talk about it, share it, follow it in the news, and if you're not involved with a disabled people's organisation or a disabled activist group, find one in your area, join up. If there isn't one, you know what? Get together with some friends and start one. I think one of the kind of positive things of this is that, we talked about the fear of the brown envelope. And it's quite nice that we're sending the DWP an envelope that they should be afraid of.
I love that.
Yes, Rick, we should use that. Okay, so thanks so much, Rick. And after this, if you signed up on Eventbrite, we'll send you an email with the link to the Crowd Justice and some other information. But just to say thanks so much to everybody for coming today. And you can stay up to date on all of our work on our websites, which we'll share too. And I'd just like to take a moment to thank all of the speakers who've given up their time today. So Rick, Will and Laura and Rosa, thank you so much for making time. And thanks to everybody who attended.
I'm off to buy a brown envelope to put my letter in and send it to DWP by snail mail. I love it.
And I'm sorry that we haven't managed to answer all of the questions. If your question is particularly burning and you'd like to make sure somebody answers it, you could send it to us on info@foxglove.org.uk and we will certainly get back to you. But thanks so much, and we hope to see or speak to many of you soon.